Wordsworth famously said that poetry comes from emotion recollected in tranquility. And since we talked about emotion last time, I thought today we'd take on the recollection part, or memory.
But never the tranquility part, though. You couldn't have just put me on a shelf in some garage or basement somewhere, where I wouldn't have to put up with all of this all the time, could you?
Well, if I did that, just think of all the great memories we wouldn't have.
Every memory I have is a great memory I don't have.
Oh, come on, bud. We've had some times, haven't we?
And you really want to relive them.
Well, I mean, there was that trip to the Sea of Self-Doubt.
Yeah, just pick the worst memory right from the start.
Well, there was that one time that I ended up really small.
Right.
And then our trip to Mars was pretty.
Bud, my mind is a dungeon full of the decaying memory remnants of a life wasted by incompetence in the highest places. Why do you think shoving more putrescence in there is a good idea?
I don't know, but I kind of liked Mars. But anyway, the point is that people have memories, and memory is a common source of inspiration for poets and writers of all varieties. And in the years I've spent teaching and advising poets, I've seen a lot of mishandled memories that resulted in clumsier poems than their writers might have hoped for. So today, we'll talk about a few principles for writing about memories more productively. What do you say?
What does it matter?
What does anything matter?
Touché.
Well, one of the most common issues I see when people start writing from memory is that they just write too much, or to be more precise, they write about too much. They try to write a poem about their childhood, or about the last summer of high school, or about the week they spent camping, or about that time they lived abroad. And I understand the impulse. That big experience is a significant memory. And when you sit down to write from memory, you say, oh yeah, that whole camping trip. And then before you know it, you've got a poem crammed full of everything that happened on that trip. And so people end up trying to write just one poem when in reality, everything that happened could be a whole book of poems. Remember, poems tend to be small with a tight focus and a laser-pointed purpose. And to be honest, it's not just poems. It happens all the time. I think people want to write the one big thing instead of several smaller things. So as a result, I spend my time writing comments like any one of these paragraphs could be a whole essay, or any one of these lines could be the source for a whole poem. So let's take a look at Robert Hershon's poem, Sentimental Moment, or Why Did the Baguette Cross the Road? It takes its inspiration from a parent reflecting on a lifetime of raising a now grown son and still seeing him as a child. But instead of listing every single experience where the reality of the son's adulthood clashes with the parent's memories of his childhood, we get just one in the opening stanza. Don't fill up on bread, I say absent-mindedly. The servings here are huge. To which, in the second stanza, the son, whose hair is receding, asks if he really just got the little kid treatment. This is a short poem that grows out of a single tiny memory. But let's not miss the point. I'm not saying that your poem has to be small, but I am saying that your poem should be focused. We talked about the importance of communicating emotions clearly and meaningfully in the last video, and here we have a parent reflecting on the tension between their son now and their son as he was. But how much focus would we lose if the poem went on and on about the restaurant they were at, and about what they ordered, and about why they were meeting there in the first place, and what did the kid order when he was 6, and what do they all do for work, and you get my point. Hershon recognizes that we don't need all that. The poem isn't about the restaurant. It's about a parent who still reflexively treats their son as a child. So much of the detail that could be included in this poem wouldn't actually help the poem to serve its purpose. And that's important to remember. It's not a question of what could be in your poem, but of what must be in your poem. There's so much this poem could say that we don't frankly need to know in order to understand what this poem has to say. And of course, you probably shouldn't worry too much about anything when you're just drafting, but when it comes to revision, go back through and look at the different details and aspects of memory in a piece. Do they serve the core purpose of the poem? If not, get rid of them. If you can see details clustering around 2 or more purposes, well, that's a sign that your one poem should be 2, or maybe a whole collection. If we think of the emotional arc of the poem as its argument, then the images and memories you include kind of work like evidence. So if some of your memories were about how much you hated sleeping in a tent during the campout, and some of your memories are about how much you liked finding out you were kind of good at archery, well, it's possible that those 2 ideas go together in a necessary way. But it's also probable that you're writing a poem that's taking on more than it needs to and would be better served as 2 poems. Any single poem does not need to be your autobiography, so begin by being selective about the memories that make it into any one poem. Hershon didn't need to reflect on an entire life to draw out a moving emotional insight. and neither do you. In addition to being selective, then, you also want to be careful about how you present your memories. As our favorite poet teacher Ted Kooser puts it, there are thousands of poems drawn from the past, and then there are stories drawn from the past, just stories that haven't attained the stature of poetry because their authors haven't put quite enough pressure on them, haven't been careful enough in their selection of detail, haven't used rhythm and syntax and metaphor to heighten their effect. Good writing of all kinds requires this kind of care, this careful, meticulous selection. So just having the memory doesn't make it a poem, and just breaking your memory into lines doesn't make it a poem either. So select your memories with care, and then present them with care. And I really like the way Kooser describes it as putting pressure on them. Imagine you went on a trip to Sweden and came back and told your friend, yeah, and I went up to some farms near the Linnaeus estate and there was a boy flying a radio-controlled airplane in the sky. That's a great memory. It's a cute little anecdote, but it's not a story that has any poetic pressure put on it. But compare our little report with Karen Holmberg's poem, The Model Plane. In the second half, she describes the moment like this: a brassy buzz unmuzzled out of clouds. A toy plane spirals toward the field, tethered on a hair of glass radio wave. A foot above, the nimble pull out, skim, and roll. Those lines, like the rest of the poem, have so much delightful pressure put on them. It's not just what happened. It's what happened with consonants, assonants, shockingly precise imagery. Holmberg isn't just telling us about a memory, she's telling us about a memory in a careful way. And when I say that, I mean full of care. Not only that, but the lines are arranged in staggered waves, like the wheat buffeted in the wind earlier in the poem, and the plane at the end rising and plunging as it flies. Anyone can bore you with a rambling account of their trip to Sweden, but a poet like Holmberg will be precise in selecting one memory and then just as precise in putting pressure on that memory in order to present it with poetic care. Again, if you want some words from Kooser to live by, a poem must be something more than an anecdote arranged in lines. We've already talked about some of those techniques in this series, and we'll continue to do it in discussions to come. But now, if I spend a lot of time telling poets that their single massive poems could really be 2 or more poems, there's another thing that I find myself saying all the time. Most often, this one happens when a poet has done a good job of selecting a memory and then writing about it with care, and then still finds their poem falling flat. Technically, they're doing what they think they should be, and then they come to me and ask what's going wrong. And I usually end up responding with a version of this question. You could have written about anything in the world that you wanted to. You didn't have to write this poem, but you did. So why? Why this poem? Why this memory? Usually the writers have a really clear and interesting answer. It just hasn't ended up on the page yet. Last time, we talked about the danger of spilling too much emotion too quickly. It's the stranger at the bus stop test. If you went up to a stranger and they heard you making all those dramatic confessions, how would they feel? And this is the same test applied to a different purpose. If you choose to write about a tree in your parents' front yard, that's great, but a stranger at the bus stop is going to ask why you're telling them about that tree. Of course, you should know why you're writing about that memory, but it should also be evident to a reader why you're writing about it. We don't just want the facts of your memory, we want to know why they matter. Or as I like to remember it, your poem shouldn't just report on what happened. It should also reflect on what happened. And we see a really clear example of that in Naomi Shihab Nye's poem, Making a Fist. At the start, we see the speaker remembering being a child in the back of a car, feeling unwell and asking the mother in the front seat, "How do you know if you're going to die?" To which the mother responds, "When you can no longer make a fist." It's kind of an amusing anecdote, but in the last stanza, the poem reflects on the memory and tells us why the speaker cares about that memory and why we, as readers, might find it meaningful too. Years later, I smile to think of that journey, the borders we must cross separately, stamped with our unanswerable woes. I, who did not die, who am still living, still lying in the back seat behind all my questions, clenching and opening one small hand. Here, you can start to see so many of the things that we've talked about coming together. Careful selection of a memory gives the poet a chance to build emotions through concrete, specific imagery, and then we get a clear so what, a reflection on why it all matters. You could write a lengthy abstract thesis on the nature of mortality, but instead we get a punchy little dose of life and death by way of an isolated memory from childhood. I mean, how different if the poem had just been, yeah, so one time I was in the car with my mom and we were driving around Tampico as we did at the time, but one time I was pretty sick and I felt so bad in the back seat that I thought I might be dying. So I asked my mom, how do you know if you're dying? And she said, well, if you can't make a fist, and I guess I'm still here, so I wasn't dying. What could you say to that besides, in the words of the ancient memes, cool story, bro? Obviously, you want your reader to respond with something a little more meaningful than that. So you can, like in this poem, spend some time reflecting, or like with other poems, infusing your reflection with emotional language and other cues to help orient your reader to why your memory is worth talking about. But there's one more thing that I hear from writers all the time as they work with memory that, frankly, I'm always a little surprised as an issue. And you might be surprised too, or you might be one of those sincere souls who says, I can't write about my memories because whenever I try to, I can't remember things exactly as they were. Well, do I have news for you, friend? You're writing poetry, not history. But to be a little more serious, number one, I think these writers are concerned about being truthful. But there's really nothing dishonest about having a fallible human memory. And number two, I do really mean what I said, and readers generally aren't coming to poetry with the expectation that it be a solemn account of the past. Poems and their readers are generally more concerned about the emotional gesture of the work and less about its forensic fidelity. And this is also a part of why you'll find experienced poets and teachers of poetry talking about the speaker of the poem. In a workshop setting in a classroom, for example, you might get some training to address another writer by saying something like, I really like the part where the speaker reflects on being in their grandfather's shed, instead of saying, I like the part where you talk about your grandfather's shed. Now, it's reasonable to assume that poets are writing about themselves, but that is a risky assumption. For example, the Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa wrote poems in several distinct personas known as heteronyms. When he published a poem as Álvaro de Campos, it would be precisely incorrect to say to Pessoa, oh, I really like that part where you were writing about being in your grandfather's shed. It wasn't Pessoa and it wasn't in his own voice. So you simply cannot assume that the voice in the poem is meant to be the writer's own voice. They may not have a grandfather with a shed. Maybe they've made up a shed in order to make an emotional point, which is maybe a long way of saying, just relax. Nobody is expecting your poems to be historical records, and there's no reason to let your expectedly imperfect memory be the reason you can't write. If you're describing your great-grandmother's kitchen and mention the green clock on the wall, and then years later find a photograph with an orange clock, who cares? Or maybe you've heard the sometimes tiresome cliche that when all is said and done, people won't remember what you said, but they will remember how you made them feel. That's the point of the poem, to make your reader feel something. And because readers of poetry don't come expecting strict factual accuracy, you have all kinds of room for artistic license. So let's look at Geraldine Connolly's poem, The Summer I Was 16. The poem presents itself as the speaker's memory of being a 16-year-old girl, and we get catalogs of really specific details. Past cherry colas, hot dogs, dreamsicles, we came to the counter where bees staggered into root beer cups and drowned. We gobbled cotton candy torches, sweet as furtive kisses, shared on benches beneath summer shadows, cherry, elm, sycamore. Now, this could be Connolly's first-person memory of her own experiences of the summer of 1963, or it could just be a poem meant to evoke the feelings of the summers of the 60s without really being an accurate autobiographical account. If it mattered to the poem would tell us. It doesn't tell us, though, so we can be satisfied with this being the experience of the speaker, whoever she is or isn't. And again, this could all be literally true, but do we think that the speaker, who is preoccupied with water sliding and sunbathing and furtive kisses and listening to the radio, is also stopping to take specific note of when she's sitting in the shade of a cherry tree versus an elm versus a sycamore? I mean, I really doubt that the speaker has a diary somewhere with an entry that says, July 19th, 1963, Dear Diary, today I sat in the shade of a cherry tree and ate cotton candy. No, those are not historical details. They're specific images meant to evoke the time. The specificity grounds us in a time and place and helps to verify the emotional arc of the piece. All of that carefree fun of summer ending with the speaker tossing a glance through the chain link at an improbable world beyond the fence. I'd believe that the concession stand at the pool did sell cherry colas, hot dogs, and dreamsicles. I'm sure it sold other things too, but I also wouldn't be surprised if on that specific day in question, the cherry cola happened to be sold out, but it doesn't really matter for the poem. The list of concessions, again, serves the purpose of evoking the background emotion of the poem. It's not meant to give us an accurate concessions inventory on any given day. You're allowed to write poems from the perspective of historical figures, or from the perspective of your great-great-grandparents who farmed in Nebraska, or from the perspective of a hippopotamus arguing with Beethoven about oil painting in the kingdom in the clouds where the trees are all periwinkle-colored mushrooms. We're not reading poetry for the facts. We're reading it for the feelings and the insights about the human experience or whatever else. Now, obviously, don't go around lying because that also fails the stranger at the bus stop test. But there is wiggle room. Unlike nonfiction, poetry isn't making claims that it's a factual business. When in doubt, the poem's voice isn't yours, it's the speaker's. And that could give you all the cover you need. Huh?
Do you know what I said?
Well, no.
But how do you feel?
A little sick.
Guess it's true. They really will only remember how you make them feel.
Right. Well, I guess that's all there was for today. As long as you're keeping your poems focused rather than trying to take on every memory all at once, as long as you're putting pressure on your memories to turn them into poems rather than anecdotes, as long as you're reflecting and not just reporting, and as long as you're relaxing and focused on building compelling emotional experiences instead of worrying about every fact in detail, I think you're going to be just fine. So keep plumbing your memories for inspiration, and we'll see you next time to talk about more wonderful stuff.